I actually do want you to expand further on the dynamics of that region, in particular about what you were just talking about, because you've described Israel as an internal element within US monopoly, capitalism, and imperialism. Can you clarify what you mean by this and explain how Israel serves as a strategic outpost for US imperialism?
Okay. To make what I say clear, in most sort of political discussion about relations between states and so on, they take two states and they try to discuss this relationship between two states and so on, assuming that each state is independent and is entering, say, into an alliance with a second state and vice versa. So you have maybe a more dependent relationship between one and the other, whereby one is weaker than the other, but you're still talking about two independent states with their own ruling classes, their own politics and economics, and so on. I think in the case of Israel and the United States, we need to refocus ourselves in terms of the true nature of the relationship between Israel and the United States. Israel, as we know, was founded on the back of the support of the British Empire. British imperialism was the major imperialist power in the world that backed and enabled ultimately the founding of Israel. And Israel remained within that sphere, if you like, following the domination of Britain and partly France of the Middle East. These were the dominant powers in the area. And after World War II and establishment of Israel in 1948, Britain was getting weaker, but within the Middle East, it was still the dominant power. But it was giving way gradually to US imperialism. And in relationship to Israel, by 1956, US-Israeli relations took a turn which was very strategic and quite important, because in 1956, there was a war launched by Britain, France, and Israel on Egypt. In the Arab world, and amongst progressive circles in the world, is called the tripartite aggression. The tripartite aggression was a war planned by Britain, France, and Israel. Israeli forces conquered Sinai and Gaza, by the way, and reached the Suez Canal with the support of Britain and France. The United States was not involved in that war. In fact, the United States was kept in the dark. And the United States became extremely angry with both Britain and France. And within a year, the United States forced Israel to withdraw from the Sinai. This was the first very clear, concrete evidence that the United States has become the most dominant power in the Middle East. They were becoming stronger and stronger after the Second World War. They became strong in Iraq with the so-called Baghdad Pact. It was a pact to group Iraq, Pakistan, Turkey, Britain, and the US became an associate type member within that military pact. They landed forces later on in Lebanon and so on, but you could see their influence was rising and replacing the old colonial powers, namely Britain and France. And that 56 marker is the first indicator that Israel is no longer the adjunct of British imperialism, but has become dominated by US imperialism, and they were forced to withdraw their forces from Sinai. This relationship continued to get stronger economically, militarily, and technologically. The aspect of technology is quite important. Nearly all Israeli technology type firms are linked to US technology companies. Some of them are quite major and well-known names, some are less well-known, but Israeli technology companies have very close links with Silicon Valley, with technology companies in general, and also have close industrial military links with US military establishments. Some weapons are specifically made in the United States to suit warfare conditions in the Middle East and Israeli wars. The supply of armaments and economic aid to Israel is quite unique. billions of dollars are given to Israel every year, both as grants and as hidden type support through the technology agreements and through the supply of special armaments to Israel. No Israeli war as of 1956 onwards, major war, could be launched without US support, without guarantee of supplies from the United States. The biggest second example of a major war was 1967. In 1967, Israel conquered the Sinai in the so-called Seven-Day War. They occupied the Sinai, Gaza, and the Golan Heights of Syria, and remained in occupation in parts of villages of Lebanon. But majorly, they occupied the Golan Heights, and they are still in occupation of it, and they occupied Gaza and the Sinai. They were forced to withdraw from the Sinai through a US brokered agreement. Again, the US forced Israel to withdraw from Sinai, but in return, they also forced Egypt to reach a peace deal with Israel. Syria refused that peace deal, and that's why Syria remained at a state of semi-war with Israel until recent events in Syria. Syria refused to sign a peace deal whereby they would recognize Israel unless Israel withdraws from the Golan Heights. And the United States decided that the Golan Heights is too strategic for Israel to withdraw from, so they allowed Israel to stay in occupation of the Syrian Golan Heights. Now, this technological, military, economic connection between Israel and the United States has become so deeply ingrained that there is a complete dependence, not some form of limited dependence on Israel, complete dependence on the United States. All major weapons are US supplied, their Air Force, their tanks, their major munitions, intelligence, the skies of the Middle East are controlled by the US. Any plane that leaves Israel to attack, say, Iraq, which they have done, attack Lebanon, attack Syria, attack anywhere, has to get the approval of US Air Force. This is very little discussed as well in the media here, that there is no such thing as a major Israeli war, especially using Air Force and so on, without US military say-so, because the skies of the Middle East are dominated militarily by US forces. They have AWACS planes constantly in the skies of the Middle East. They have numerous military bases throughout the Gulf region, Saudi, Egypt, Jordan, and so forth. So they have a direct presence in the Middle East that Israel in no way could launch a major war without American say-so. And that condition alone makes a phone call from Washington enough to stop any major war launched by Israel. So in terms of the politics and appearance of the relationship, the dependence of Israel on the United States has become so big. In the United States, the major capitalist establishments, monopolies in the United States, treat Israel as part of the US economy. And so much so that within the political sphere, Israel is regarded as part of the United States in terms of defending it, in terms of supplying it, in terms of depending on its strategic presence and importance as a military base, US military base in the region. Israel is a major nuclear power. It has close to 200 nuclear bombs. It is part and parcel of US defense strategies in the Middle East and in Europe. Israel is only a stone's throw away from Europe. In any major conflagration in the world, Israel will be depended upon by the United States to launch nuclear bombs, nuclear weapons, to use its air force, its intelligence, and so on, at the service of US imperialism. So it is a major military base that the United States uses. Now, we have phenomena like APAC, like major lobby groups in the United States that on the surface appear to be running US policy. I think this is a fallacy. I think the United States allows these groups to flourish because they do serve US imperialist interests in the region. If Israel, by any chance, contradicts major US policies, then these groups, these lobbies will be truncated, will be limited in their influence. They are given a free hand because it suits US imperialism to give them the free hand. They ultimately are instruments of convincing the American public of the importance of Israel. And by the way, APAC, in its propaganda in the United States, and even Netanyahu's speech, that obscene speech in Congress several months ago, when he received 57 standing ovations from the senators and House of Representative members at the US Congress, he explicitly said, "We are the power that serves the United States. We are the most loyal, the most dependent force in the Middle East." And for that, he received the greatest ovation of all, that this is the state that they can depend on in the Middle East, and they cannot depend on the Arab regimes. Talking about the Arab regimes hold on to this notion, this fallacy, that Israel and the Jews control the United States. Arab regimes have propagated this from 1948 onwards, that if only we as Arabs, as Palestinians, convince the United States that Israel is against US interests ultimately, does not serve US interests, then maybe the United States will get rid of the influence of the Jewish lobby, and the United States will start befriending the Palestinians and the Arabs. This was used and is still used today by the Arab regimes to justify their alliance with the United States. Their propaganda is almost to portray US imperialism as poor victims of Israeli dominance, Israeli domination. This allows the Arab regimes to use the petrodollars to invest in the United States. Trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars, are invested in the United States and in US firms, and some in Britain, some in France, in the West, but major investments of the petrodollars of the Middle East, trillions of them over the years, have been invested in the United States. Famously, Trump went to visit Saudi during his first term and literally forced, and he boasted about it himself, forced Saudi and the Gulf states to give the United States $500 billion worth of investment, and they all agreed and they shipped it. In a recent phone call by the Saudi Crown Prince with Trump, he promised him, if he becomes a bit more friendly and listens to some of Saudi ideas about Palestine and so on, then Saudi will invest $600 billion over the next 4 years in the United States. Trump joked about it. He said, I asked him for $1 trillion to be invested. And he was famous declaring about 5 years ago that the Gulf regimes would not stay in power for more than 2 weeks without US support. So these are mostly client regimes, although it has to be noted as well, and we shouldn't be oversimplistic there. These regimes rule populations which are angry, populations which are politically aware, populations which are essentially anti-imperialist. So now and then they have to stop being such clients of US imperialism. And they do actually have some contradictions with the United States. You could see it in the economic field, some in the political field, including now when Trump declared that Gaza should be ethnically cleansed. Unanimously, all the Arab regimes opposed it, including a very strongly worded statement from the Saudi government, interestingly. So you could see that there is fear of the population. The Egyptian people are well over 100 million, and they are fiercely patriotic and pro-Palestine. Saudi population is over 30 million, and there are very strong, although heavily repressed, opposition within Saudi. Same with Iraq, Syria. Well, there are active resistance forces, obviously, in Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, which will not be subdued so easily by the US and Israel. So you have a situation where Israel is the most dependent of US bases in the world, practically. Arab regimes are quite a number of them are client regimes, but with their own contradictions with US imperialism. Contradictions between Israeli ruling class and the US ruling class do exist because this is a dynamic situation, but essentially over all major issues, for all intents and purposes, especially when it comes to war and peace, Israel is a total client of US imperialism, and it's the US that dominates Israeli policies and not vice versa.